The shuttle descended through layers of mist so thick that the metallic hull hissed from the moisture condensing on its surface. When the landing struts finally touched the ground, the jungle swallowed the sound in a wet, echoing hush. The canopy above was so dense that almost no sunlight reached the soil. Massive roots twisted like serpents through the earth, and the air felt heavy enough to drink. The moment the hatch opened, a wall of humid air rolled inside, hot and filled with the cries of unseen creatures. The cadets of the Galactic Academy stepped out, their equipment gleaming under faint rays of greenish light filtering through the leaves. Among them was a human named Liam, the only one of his kind in the group. He squinted as the wet heat hit his face, then inhaled deeply. The scent of decay and life mixed together in a way that made him both uneasy and fascinated. For most of the alien cadets, the climate was unbearable from the start. The reptilian Varkans hissed irritably as their scales glistened with condensation, unused to moisture this intense. The avian Zairi tried to shake the rain from their feathers, which clumped together immediately. The insectoid Kalar clicked in distress as their translucent wings stuck to their backs. Even the normally stoic mammalian Turin wiped his brow and muttered something about the air being thick as soup. They began unloading tent materials from the supply crates, eager to assemble shelters before nightfall. Liam, however, didn't rush. He let his backpack hang loosely on one shoulder and simply watched. Everywhere around him, the forest moved. The trunks weren't still. They swayed ever so slightly, responding to wind currents above. Vines dripped continuously, feeding into small pools that shimmered with oily reflections. Giant leaves the size of sails formed overlapping roofs high above, catching and releasing water like massive natural gutters. Liam noticed how the ground pulsed faintly under his boots. It was alive, breathing, teeming with roots and microorganisms that made the soil sponge-like. When he knelt to touch it, his fingers came away dark with mud and the smell of damp earth. The others avoided it, setting up portable flooring plates before building their tents. To them, the ground was hostile, dirty, unpredictable. To him, it was potential. He remembered a line his grandfather used to say during camping trips on Earth. Nature always provides. You just need to look with the right eyes. The words echoed in his head as he studied the trees. Their bark wasn't rough like Earth's oak or pine. Instead, it was fibrous and slightly elastic, capable of holding enormous weight without snapping. He tapped one with his knuckle, and it responded with a dull, resonant tone, like hollow wood. Above, tangled branches formed platforms where thick moss grew. He could see shapes of large creatures resting there, invisible except for the occasional flick of a tail or the blink of reflective eyes. The upper levels of this jungle, he realized, were drier. The mist clung to the lower ground, while higher up, sunlight faintly shimmered through breaks in the canopy. That's where he wanted to be. While others cursed the rain and argued about the best spot for their camp, Liam climbed a nearby rise to get a better view. The slope was slippery, and the mud clung to his boots, but he moved with a calm rhythm. Once he reached the top, he could see the full scale of Verdara III's wilderness, stretching endlessly in every direction. The forest wasn't just alive, it was layered like a city, with ecosystems stacked on top of one another. The ground was chaos and moisture, but above, the branches offered stability and protection. It was there, in that suspended world, that he decided he would build his shelter. When he returned to the group, most of the aliens had already begun constructing their tents. Shimmering membranes stretched over metal frames, forming transparent domes that glowed faintly from internal energy cells. The air hummed with mechanical activity as autosealers activated and vents purred to life. To an engineer's eye, the scene would have looked efficient and orderly. To Liam, it looked fragile. The rain came harder now, turning into a vertical river that battered the domes relentlessly. Within minutes, droplets found their way through seams, dripping onto sleeping mats. The cadets muttered in frustration, tightening seals, adjusting stabilizers, doing everything they could to resist the inevitable. The jungle didn't care about their technology. It always found a way in. Liam set his small pack under a broad, natural overhang formed by the roots of a colossal tree. He didn't unpack his tent. Instead, he took out a small journal soaked already from humidity and began sketching. His lines were quick and purposeful. The structure of the trunk, the curvature of branches, the way vines spiraled like ready-made ropes. He wasn't thinking of a temporary shelter. He was thinking of something sustainable, something that worked with the jungle instead of against it. The sound of the rain above became rhythmic, almost soothing. It wasn't a storm to him. It was energy, a cycle he could use. By nightfall, the camp was miserable. The ground-level tents were flooded halfway up their bases. The Kalar's wings buzzed angrily in the dark, unable to dry. The Zyri huddled under leaking roofs, their feathers dripping continuously. Even the Turin's heavy-furred body shivered in the cool air that came with evening. Liam, meanwhile, sat cross-legged near the massive tree, a small lantern beside him, tracing his plans with a sharpened stick. He noticed how certain vines had a fibrous inner layer that twisted easily without breaking. He tested their strength by tying one end around a stone and pulling with both hands. It held firm. Another discovery followed, large cup-shaped leaves that collected rainwater perfectly without tearing. He could use them as roofing material. When the others tried to sleep, their complaints filled the air. Too wet, too hot, too loud. The jungle echoed their discomfort, insects screaming in waves that rose and fell like a heartbeat. Liam didn't try to rest. He found a long, sturdy root that angled upward and used it to climb a few meters into the lower branches. There, he secured his pack to a fork in the tree and tied himself in with a belt, balancing carefully. The bark felt damp but solid, and the air was cooler above the ground. For the first time since landing, he felt a breeze. Not much, but enough to remind him that fresh air existed beyond the swamp of humidity below. As the night deepened, the rain softened into a steady whisper. Bioluminescent insects blinked in the dark, drifting like living lanterns. The camp below looked pitiful, small glows of artificial light scattered across the mud, each one surrounded by restless movement. Liam leaned back against the trunk and exhaled. He thought about Earth's forests, the pine needles underfoot, the crisp smell of early morning dew. It was strange, he reflected, how a human brain could find comfort in the unknown just by recognizing a rhythm, rain, wind, distant thunder. He smiled faintly. While the others tried to conquer this place, he would learn from it. He drifted in and out of light sleep through the night, awakened occasionally by animal calls echoing through the canopy. Once he opened his eyes and saw a massive silhouette gliding silently between branches, a predator of some kind, but it didn't notice him. The higher elevation seemed to keep him invisible. That small realization filled him with a quiet satisfaction. He was safe, not because he was armed, but because he had chosen the right perspective. When dawn came, it was a dim green glow filtering through layers of leaves. The air felt fresher, and the smell of wet soil rose from below. Liam climbed down slowly, his hands slick with condensation but steady. The camp was a disaster. The aliens were exhausted, their supplies damp, their tempers short. The ground looked like a battlefield of broken stakes and fallen tarps. Yet amid the chaos, Liam moved with calm precision, collecting fallen branches and lengths of vine. He had already chosen his site, the twin trees whose roots formed a natural bridge. While others prepared breakfast in silence, he walked into the jungle again, measuring the width between the trunks with outstretched arms. He wasn't building for a night or two. He was building something that would last. As he began stripping vines and carving marks into bark, a sense of purpose anchored him. The jungle no longer felt alien. It was becoming familiar, almost cooperative. The trees creaked softly, the rain resumed its rhythm, and above him, light broke through just enough to shimmer across his wet hands. For everyone else, the jungle of Verdara 3 was misery. For Liam, it was an opportunity, a blank canvas suspended in green silence. By the time the second sunset bled through the endless canopy, the air had turned almost unbreathable. The rain never truly stopped. It only shifted between heavy downpours and fine mist that clung to skin like sweat. The alien cadets sat around their half-flooded tents, shivering despite the heat, their morale already slipping. The reptilian Varkans hissed irritably, scraping mud from between their scales. The avian Zyri crouched with drooping feathers, their wings hanging uselessly at their sides. Even the stoic Turin, whose thick fur made him nearly impervious to cold, had dark circles under his eyes from lack of rest. The jungle was winning, and the night hadn't even begun. Liam stood apart from the others, his gaze fixed upward. The first night had taught him one truth: ground was the enemy. It swallowed warmth, drained strength, and turned every hour of rest into a fight. He was tired too, his shoulders aching from the climb earlier, his palms raw from the fibrous bark. Yet he felt something the others didn't: clarity. The environment wasn't cruel by nature, it was indifferent. That indifference could be overcome with understanding, not resistance. He had no intention of spending another night in the mud. The cadet's instructor, an elderly insectoid named Professor Jour, fluttered his thin wings in irritation as he observed the chaos. His voice buzzed faintly as he called out instructions, urging the group to reinforce their shelters and activate their thermal liners. No one listened properly. Exhaustion made their movements sluggish. When the instructor finally retreated to his private dome, muttering about natural selection, the camp descended into restless silence. Liam retrieved a bundle of vines and a sharpened bone knife he had shaped earlier. He didn't have advanced tools like the others, but he didn't need them. He found one of the colossal trees he had studied the previous day and began climbing again, pressing his boots into the soft, ridged bark. The rain slicked every surface, yet his grip held. The deeper he climbed, the cooler the air became, and soon the sound of the camp below faded into the whisper of leaves. The tree's limbs spread wide enough to hold his weight with ease. He reached a branch that forked into 3 sturdy arms, forming a natural foundation. This would be his refuge. He pulled the first vine tight, looping it around one branch and knotting it twice before stretching it across to the opposite side. The fibers squeaked against the bark as he tightened them. Piece by piece, he created a web, a simple frame that would hold whatever structure he could build. The process was slow, his fingers numb from the chill, but his concentration never wavered. With every knot he tied, the idea of comfort seemed less like a luxury and more like survival. Below him, the jungle roared to life. The nocturnal creatures began their chorus. Low growls, distant shrieks, and the clicking of unseen mandibles. Bioluminescent fungi glowed faintly on nearby trunks, painting the shadows with a ghostly green hue. The campfires below sputtered and died, leaving only the dull gleam of the tents. Liam felt both isolated and free. He was above the noise, above the damp misery. For the first time since arrival, he could see a hint of the sky through gaps in the canopy, a sheet of dark blue veined with silver lightning in the distance. He worked through the night, pausing only when exhaustion forced him to rest against the trunk. He stripped broad leaves from nearby vines and wove them into panels, layering them to form a surface that shed water easily. The smell of crushed greenery filled the air, sharp and refreshing. When he finished the first layer, he tested it by pouring a handful of rainwater from his flask. The water slid cleanly off, leaving the surface dry. A small smile tugged at his lips. Progress. As he worked, he noticed small details that no one else had cared to observe. Some vines had tiny nodules that glowed faintly, their sap bioluminescent. When mixed with mud, that sap created a faint, cold light, enough to see without attracting predators. He dabbed a little of it along his wrist, illuminating his workspace with a soft blue shimmer. The jungle seemed to breathe with him now, its rhythm aligning with his own. Down below, the sounds of frustration grew louder. The Kalar shouted something in their clicking dialect about water in the rations. Another cadet cursed loudly as his sleeping pad floated away in a puddle. Liam didn't look down. He had no desire to share their suffering. He wasn't being cruel. He simply understood that pity wouldn't help anyone survive. By midnight, his structure resembled a suspended nest, supported by interwoven vines and anchored tightly to 3 branches. It wasn't large, but it was stable. He pulled himself inside, testing the balance. The tree swayed gently, but the platform held. Above him, rain continued to fall, but the overlapping leaves he had woven earlier diverted most of it away. It wasn't perfect. Drops still fell through gaps, landing coolly on his neck, but it was better than any tent below. He lay back, exhaling, listening to the endless rhythm of the rain striking leaves. His thoughts drifted to mornings on Earth, those quiet dawns when his father brewed coffee over an open fire during their mountain trips. The steam, the smell of roasted beans, the way warmth spread through the air, it all came to him like a forgotten melody. He didn't have coffee now, but the memory was enough to make him smile. Comfort, he realized, wasn't a matter of tools or luxury. It was the ability to make peace with discomfort. Hours passed. At some point, he must have dozed off because he woke abruptly to a noise, a deep, guttural growl from somewhere below. He froze. Through the foliage, he could see faint movement. Something large prowled near the camp, its eyes glinting orange in the darkness. The aliens stirred in panic, their lights flashing as they scrambled inside their shelters. Liam stayed still, gripping a branch tightly. The creature didn't climb. It stalked the perimeter, sniffing the air. He could hear the wet crunch of its steps in the mud. Then, just as silently as it had appeared, it retreated into the shadows. When the noise faded, Liam released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His elevated position had saved him. Again. The safety of height was no longer just a comfort, it was a strategy. From above, he could see danger coming. From above, he could rest without fear. The realization settled in his mind like an unspoken rule. The jungle belonged to those who adapted vertically. As dawn approached, the rain softened into mist. The first light filtered through the dense leaves, painting the forest in shades of green and gold. Liam stretched his sore limbs and looked down at the camp. The sight almost made him laugh. Half the tents had collapsed during the night, their occupants now sitting miserably in ankle-deep mud. Professor Zure paced furiously, shouting about discipline and engineering incompetence, his tiny wings flicking water everywhere. No one answered him. They were too tired, too demoralized. Liam climbed down quietly and landed on the damp ground. The others looked up, startled by his calm expression. He didn't look like someone who had just endured the same night. His clothes were damp but clean, his eyes sharp and focused. One of the Zyri glared at him, suspicion in her gaze, but said nothing. He simply nodded to her and began collecting fallen branches, ignoring the curious stares. The morning routine resumed with bitterness. Rations were wet, tempers short, and morale low. Yet Liam worked methodically, stripping bark and coiling vines. He wasn't trying to show off. He was preparing for what he knew would come. A test of endurance that would break anyone relying solely on equipment. When the instructor demanded a progress report, Liam barely looked up from his work. "I'm building higher," he said simply. The professor tilted his head, his mandibles clicking in disbelief, but offered no response. By midday, the rain returned, drenching everything once more. The cadets cursed and tightened their tents for the 100th time. Liam climbed back into his treehouse, now slightly more stable, and tied a small bundle of leaves overhead. The shelter deflected the downpour efficiently, keeping his gear dry. He sat cross-legged, watching rivulets of water stream down his improvised gutters. He didn't smile this time. He didn't need to. The satisfaction came from knowing he had already moved beyond survival. He was beginning to shape comfort. The sound of thunder rolled across the sky as a new storm formed on the horizon. The air grew thick again, the forest trembling with approaching wind. Below, panic spread as tents began to buckle. Liam remained still, breathing steadily as the tree swayed under him. His shelter flexed but didn't break. The storm howled, tearing at the jungle, but he stayed dry. Through sheets of rain, he could barely make out the shapes of his fellow cadets rushing to reinforce their camps. He watched silently, not with arrogance, but with quiet understanding. That night, as lightning flashed and the rain roared like a waterfall, Liam realized something profound. The others were still fighting the jungle, trying to impose order on chaos. He, on the other hand, had learned to listen. Each creak of the tree, each gust of wind, each droplet that fell, it was all part of a rhythm he had begun to understand. He was no longer a visitor in this world. The jungle had accepted him, and in return, he had found peace above the storm. By the third day, the jungle had settled into a rhythm that only Liam seemed to understand. The rain would arrive just before dawn, thick and relentless, soaking the world until every sound was muffled by the hiss of falling water. Then, by mid-morning, a faint calm would return, only to be broken again by sudden bursts of wind or animal cries echoing through the trees. Most of the cadets dreaded this cycle. It left them sleepless, frustrated, and slow. Liam had learned to move with it. When the storm came, he waited. When the calm arrived, he built. His muscles ached from climbing, and his hands were lined with cuts, but his focus never wavered. He had decided what his treehouse would be, a real home suspended above the swamp. The structure he had started now hung between two massive trunks, like a bridge of woven life. The vines he had tied days earlier had dried into something close to rope, tightening naturally as they lost moisture. He tested each line before trusting it, pulling with his full weight. The leaves he had layered overhead had begun to brown at the edges, so he replaced them with larger, more resilient ones he found higher up. He noticed that the broad, red-tinted leaves from one particular species repelled water better than others and had a faint, waxy coating that gleamed when wet. He gathered as many as he could carry, wrapping them into neat bundles secured by fibrous stems. Every movement he made had a purpose. Every discovery was an improvement. Below him, the camp was a picture of misery. The tents sagged, some half collapsed, others torn by wind. The cadets argued constantly now. The Zyri had begun blaming the reptilian Varkans for hoarding dry rations, while the Terran accused both of them of wasting power cells trying to heat their shelters. Even the instructor had stopped intervening. He stayed inside his sealed dome most of the time, his translucent wings visible only as faint outlines through the mist. Liam rarely looked down anymore. The noise of discontent had become background sound, proof that his instincts had been right. The morning light filtered weakly through the treetops as he worked on his latest addition, a system for collecting and storing rainwater. It had started as a thought while he lay half awake during the night, listening to the constant drip from the canopy. Water was endless here, but using it efficiently was the real challenge. He began by hollowing a length of fallen branch, scraping the soft inner layer until he had a smooth wooden tube. He positioned it along a slight downward angle, secured with vine lashings, leading to a large section of bark shaped like a basin. The first time the rain returned, he watched with quiet satisfaction as water flowed naturally through his creation, collecting into the basin with a soft rhythm. He built 3 more of these gutters, connecting them in a circular system that directed overflow into smaller containers below. Within an hour, he had a functioning reservoir. He washed his hands in the clear water and laughed softly to himself. The simplicity of it felt almost unfair. The others were still struggling to keep their feet dry, yet he was already designing luxuries. The thought made him pause, not out of arrogance, but reflection. Humans had always been creatures of adaptation. On Earth, they had learned to thrive in deserts, mountains, and frozen plains, not because they were the strongest or fastest, but because they could see opportunity where others saw obstacles. This jungle was no different. The next problem he wanted to solve was comfort. The branch floor of his platform, though functional, was uneven and hard. He decided to weave a sleeping mat from flexible stems of a creeping plant he had seen wrapping around nearby trees. Its texture was soft and slightly springy when dried. He cut lengths of it and began interlacing them in a pattern he remembered from old camping hammocks his father used to own. It took hours, and his fingers cramped from tension, but by the time the sun dipped below the horizon, he had something that resembled a bed. He secured it between 2 branches and lay down carefully. The surface flexed under his weight, firm yet yielding. For the first time in days, he smiled fully, closing his eyes as the last light faded into emerald dusk. That night, while the others groaned through another round of rain and insects, Liam lay in his elevated shelter, dry and still. The jungle was loud but no longer hostile to him. He could hear the rustling of creatures in the branches above, the croaking of amphibians below, and the rhythmic fall of droplets on the roof he had built. The sound blended into something hypnotic. He thought about how strange it was to find peace in a place that had broken everyone else. His eyelids grew heavy, and for the first time since arriving on Verdera 3, he slept deeply and without interruption. When dawn came, he awoke to the faint light of sunrise filtering through the leaves. The air smelled fresh, carrying a sweetness from nearby blossoms. He stretched, climbed down to check his water collectors, and found them full. His reflection rippled faintly in the surface of the basin, distorted by movement, but he caught his own grin before it vanished. He brewed a drink by crushing roasted jungle seeds he had found the previous day, mixing them with hot water from a heated stone. The aroma filled the air rich and bitter, resembling coffee enough to make his chest tighten with nostalgia. Steam rose from the cup as he sat on the edge of his platform, looking out over the mist-covered forest. The smell drew attention quickly. A few curious cadets looked up from below, confused. One of the Zyri shielded her eyes and called up to him, asking what he was doing. Liam didn't answer. He simply lifted the cup to his lips and took a slow sip. The others whispered among themselves, the jealousy unmistakable. He knew that soon they would come closer, not out of admiration, but disbelief. How could one human with no advanced tools live in such comfort while everyone else struggled? He didn't plan to explain. It wasn't about defiance. It was about proving a point through action. Later that morning, the inevitable happened. 2 cadets, one Varkan and one Zairi, climbed partway up his tree to inspect his work. Their reactions were almost comical. They stared at the rainwater system, then at the mat, then at the simple cup in his hand. The Varkan muttered in disbelief, asking if he had stolen equipment from the instructor. Liam shook his head and showed him the vine lashings and wooden gutters. "Nature built this," he said simply. "I just borrowed her tools." The Varkan didn't respond. He was too busy examining the clean water trickling from the system into the basin. The Zairi tilted her head, feathers twitching with intrigue. "You live up here?" she asked quietly. Liam nodded once. "It's drier," he replied. When the two finally descended, word spread quickly. By midday, the rest of the cadets had gathered below his tree, pointing and murmuring. Some were skeptical, others impressed. The instructor emerged from his dome and craned his thin neck upward. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then his mandibles clicked softly, and he turned back toward camp without comment. Liam could tell what that silence meant. Approval disguised as indifference. He spent the rest of the day reinforcing his design. He added a secondary platform for storage, lashing it tightly to the main trunk, and began constructing a simple ladder from knotted vines for easier access. His movements had become instinctive. When he worked, he didn't think in steps. He thought in flows, letting the jungle guide his hands. He began collecting hollow fruit shells that had dried into sturdy bowls, arranging them along a branch as makeshift containers. The structure slowly evolved from a survival shelter into a home. When evening came, he lit a small firestone on a branch, using the blue flame sparingly for warmth. He sipped the last of his bitter drink and listened to the faint hum of nocturnal life beginning again. The camp below was quieter tonight. Fewer arguments echoed through the dark, and some of the cadets even tried stringing their own tarps between trees. He noticed this and smiled. Perhaps without meaning to, he had started a quiet revolution. Before sleeping, he looked up through a break in the canopy. For the first time since arrival, he could see the faint shimmer of stars. They looked dim through the thick atmosphere, but they were there, a reminder of the world beyond this endless green. He wondered if the academy instructors watching from orbit could see what was happening below. Probably not. To them, this was just another test in endurance and resourcefulness. But for him, it was something more. He wasn't surviving, he was creating. As the night deepened and the wind sighed through the treetops, Liam felt something shift inside him. The fear and discomfort that had defined the first days were gone, replaced by a calm certainty. He had found the rhythm of the jungle, and it was beginning to reward him. Tomorrow, he would add more, perhaps a way to channel the rainwater into a shower. The thought made him laugh quietly. The idea of bathing in clean rain while others huddled in the mud below seemed absurdly luxurious. But then again, so had sleeping dry, and he had already achieved that. He closed his eyes, letting the sound of rain fill the silence around him. The forest pulsed with life, yet he felt entirely at peace. His treehouse creaked gently as it swayed, strong and alive, just like him. In that moment, high above the flooded world, Liam understood what made humanity unique among the stars. It wasn't strength or intelligence, it was imagination. By the fourth day, the jungle's rhythm had become almost predictable to Liam, though still relentless in its intensity. The rain continued its endless cycle, but now he barely noticed it. His body had adapted, his mind sharpened, and his treehouse had become something more than shelter. It was proof of concept, a living demonstration of how thought and adaptation could turn chaos into harmony. Below, the rest of the cadets were reaching their limits. Fatigue showed in their movements, and the tension in the camp was thick enough to feel even from the treetops. Arguments had turned into silent resentment. Yet through that growing discontent, all eyes began to drift upward more and more often to the structure that stood defiant among the branches, where the human lived like a quiet god above the storm. That morning, a break in the rain came earlier than usual. The jungle glistened under rare streaks of sunlight that broke through the clouds, steam rising from every leaf and surface like breath from a slumbering beast. Liam was awake long before dawn as usual. He had added a new feature to his creation during the night, a rainwater shower made from hollow vines, and a pressure release valve carved from a segment of hardened wood. It wasn't complex by technological standards, but it was elegant. When he opened the top plug, gravity did the rest, letting clean, cool water cascade down through a fine spout. It was refreshing in a way that no bottled ration water could ever be. He stood beneath it for a moment, water running down his skin, washing away the sweat and grit of the past days. The feeling was transcendent, pure simplicity, meeting ingenuity. The sound of flowing water drew attention almost immediately. Below, one of the Sci-Fi spotted him through the foliage and gasped, calling out to others. Soon, a small group gathered under his tree, craning their necks to watch as he stood beneath the improvised shower. The water sparkled in the sunlight, turning to mist as it hit the air. Some of the cadets murmured in disbelief, others in awe. To them, the jungle had been nothing but punishment. Yet here was a human not only surviving, but thriving. It felt almost unnatural, as if he had bent the planet to his will. When he noticed their stares, Liam didn't hide or gloat. He simply closed the valve, wiped his face with a broad leaf, and nodded in greeting before climbing back onto his platform. He didn't speak a word. His silence said more than pride ever could. He brewed his morning drink again, the smell of roasted seeds drifting down toward the wet ground. The camp fell quieter than usual. Envy had a way of silencing even the loudest voices. As the sun climbed higher, the humidity returned with vengeance. The aliens below began to stir, sluggish from another sleepless night. The Varkans fanned their necks to keep cool, their scales shimmering with condensation. The Turan wrung out his soaked fur, muttering curses in his native tongue. Even the insectoid instructor emerged briefly, antennae twitching in visible irritation at the rising tension. No one dared complain to him anymore. Authority meant little when comfort and survival were slipping away. By midday, curiosity began to overcome pride. One by one, the cadets approached Liam's tree, pretending to be gathering supplies but sneaking glances upward. A few of them, emboldened by exhaustion, finally called up to him. The Sci-Fi, who had spoken before, a young female named Sears, asked how he had made the water flow like that. Her tone carried both suspicion and fascination. Liam looked down, his eyes calm and unbothered. "You start by listening," he answered. His voice was steady, not arrogant, not condescending, just factual. Sierra frowned, unsure whether it was an insult or wisdom. "Listening to what?" she asked. He smiled faintly and gestured to the forest around them. "Everything." Then he returned to his work, leaving her and the others in uneasy silence. That night, several of them tried to imitate him. They tied their tents higher into the trees, lashing vines clumsily around branches, but the results were disastrous. The vines snapped, the structures tilted, and the cadets fell into the mud more than once. Their frustration grew until shouting echoed through the jungle again. The instructor ignored it. He had long given up trying to mediate. Liam watched from above, expression unreadable. He wanted to help, but part of him knew that true understanding couldn't be handed out. It had to be earned through failure. He had learned from the jungle by observing, not demanding. They still fought against it, trying to impose control instead of cooperation. The following morning brought another storm, harsher than any before. The wind howled through the treetops, bending branches and tearing loose leaves in sheets. The rain hit like stones, and the ground below transformed into a swirling brown river. The tents were useless now. Half of them collapsed or drifted away in the flood. Cadets screamed over the roar of the wind, clutching their supplies and climbing onto tree roots for safety. From his elevated perch, Liam watched the chaos with grim focus. His own structure swayed violently, but held strong. The vines creaked, the floor trembled, yet nothing broke. He secured his water containers and crouched low, gripping the main trunk. The storm raged for what felt like hours, a relentless test of endurance and design. When it finally passed, the camp below was unrecognizable. The ground had turned into a shallow lake dotted with the remains of equipment. The once proud tents lay half-submerged, their metallic frames twisted. The instructor's dome, though still intact, was tilted at an angle, its anchor points nearly torn from the soil. Slowly, one by one, the cadets emerged from hiding, soaked and shivering. No one spoke. The silence that followed the storm was almost sacred, a heavy, humbled quiet. Then, as sunlight filtered through again, someone looked up. Liam's treehouse still stood. Not a single part of it had fallen. The vines were taut, the roof intact, the gutters still dripping water steadily into their basins. And there he was, sitting calmly on the edge, his expression thoughtful, his cup steaming faintly in his hands. That moment changed everything. The line between mockery and respect vanished. The cadets no longer saw him as strange or lucky. They saw him as something else entirely. He had achieved mastery where they had failed. It stung their pride, but it also awakened something dormant, curiosity mixed with admiration. Later that afternoon, when the camp began to rebuild, several cadets approached him again, this time with open humility. Sierra asked if he could teach her how to make the water system. The Turin, usually proud and dismissive, offered to bring strong branches in exchange for instruction. Even the Varkans, known for their competitiveness, began collecting vines without being asked. Liam hesitated at first. Part of him wanted to stay isolated, to keep his peace untouched. But as he looked down at their worn faces, he saw something familiar, the same determination that had driven him on his first night. He nodded. "I'll show you," he said quietly, "but you'll build your own." The lesson was simple but firm. He wouldn't give them his comfort, but he would teach them how to find their own. Over the next few days, the treetops became alive with activity. Under Liam's guidance, the cadets learned how to twist vines properly, how to find branches that flexed without snapping, and how to weave leaves for waterproof roofing. Some failed repeatedly, but instead of quitting, they adapted. For the first time since arriving on Verdara 3, laughter echoed through the jungle, not mocking or desperate, but genuine. The forest canopy began to fill with scattered shelters, crude at first, then more sophisticated. It wasn't uniform or perfect, but it was progress. Liam's own treehouse continued to evolve too. He added a small hanging seat crafted from roots and reinforced it with braided vines. He placed luminescent fungus in carved wooden bowls, creating gentle lights that glowed softly at night. The view from his perch had changed dramatically. What had once been a ground camp of mud and misery was now transforming into a vertical village, a web of survival elevated above the chaos. The jungle, once feared, was becoming home. One evening, Sierra climbed up to visit him. Her wings were still damp, but her expression was calm. She handed him a steaming cup, a drink she had brewed from roasted seeds he had taught her to find. "It's not as good as yours," she said shyly. He took a sip and smiled. "It's better," he replied, and he meant it. The bitterness tasted like progress. Below them, the other shelters glowed faintly in the dark, and for the first time, the jungle looked peaceful. As the wind moved through the branches, carrying the scent of wet wood and earth, Liam leaned back in his chair and watched the mist rise from the valley. The cadets had learned more than survival. They had learned harmony. It was a quiet victory, but one that would change how the academy viewed this test forever. He didn't need recognition. The sight was enough. The human had shown them not how to endure the jungle, but how to live with it. And in doing so, he had reminded them of something profound. That survival was never about fighting nature, but about becoming part of it. The forest was quiet on the morning of the instructor's return. The rain had slowed to a mist, the air heavy with the scent of wet bark and fresh growth. Sunlight filtered weakly through the canopy, catching the dew on the leaves until the whole jungle shimmered like a living cathedral of green. Birds with crystal feathers sang in the distance, and the sound of dripping water echoed softly through the trees. For the first time since the cadets had arrived on Verdara 3, the air carried peace instead of struggle. The jungle no longer felt like an enemy. It was breathing with them, patient and alive. Liam stood at the edge of his platform, gazing down at what the camp had become. Where once there had been mud and chaos, now a network of small tree houses stretched through the canopy like woven stars. Each structure was different, some rough and small, others surprisingly intricate, but all were lifted above the ground, anchored to thick trunks, and tied with the vines he had taught the cadets to use. The transformation was astonishing. The ground below, once a battlefield of broken tents and frustration, had been abandoned. Everything essential now existed above, among the leaves and the wind. It was no longer a survival camp. It was a living ecosystem, shaped by collaboration and adaptation. He smiled faintly as he watched Syrah glide between the trees, carrying a bundle of leaves under one arm. Her wings shimmered faintly in the morning light as she landed gracefully on a nearby branch, handing supplies to one of the reptilian cadets. The two worked side by side without words, moving with the fluid coordination of people who had finally learned to trust each other. The Varkans had stopped hissing at the Zairi. The Terran no longer barked orders, and even the insectoid instructor had joined in, hanging a small glider-like observation pod from the branches instead of staying in his dome. The tension that had poisoned the camp had dissolved, replaced by something rare and precious, unity born from struggle. Liam's gaze shifted upward, where morning light pierced the canopy, revealing the faint outline of a shuttle descending through the mist. The Academy insignia gleamed faintly on his hull. The end of the survival test had arrived. A deep hum vibrated through the jungle as the shuttle's engines cut through the damp air, scattering a flock of bright birds into the sky. The cadets stopped their work and looked up, silent and still. The moment they had waited for had come, but it felt different from what any of them had expected. The shuttle landed softly on a small clearing that had once been the ground camp. The soil, still dark and wet, was now covered in the debris of their first failed days, torn tents, twisted poles, and footprints half swallowed by moss. As the ramp descended, two instructors emerged, one tall and thin, wearing the black insignia of the Academy's command division, and the other stocky, with scanning devices strapped across his chest. Their boots sank slightly into the mud, and they exchanged a quick look of confusion. The clearing was empty. No tents, no cadets. Only the sound of wind through the trees. Then from above came a soft ripple of laughter. The instructors looked up and froze. The forest canopy was alive with movement. Dozens of figures moved between the branches, shadows against the filtered light. The cadets, their uniforms marked with mud and leaves, stood proudly on their treehouses, looking down at their stunned superiors. The human was the highest among them, perched on his platform, calm and composed, a steaming cup of his roasted seed brew in his hand. The sight was surreal. The lead instructor raised a communication device to his mouth, but then hesitated, eyes locked on the structures above. "Are those habitations?" he muttered. The other instructor activated his scanner, which beeped rapidly as it mapped the interconnected lattice of living wood and vines. "Structural integrity. Stable," he said in disbelief. "Temperature regulation, natural. Energy expenditure, minimal. Who authorized this?" Liam climbed down a vine ladder, descending smoothly until he stood on the edge of a lower branch, facing them. "No one," he said simply. His voice carried easily through the clearing, firm but calm. "We built them ourselves." The taller instructor stepped forward, studying him with cold curiosity. "You were instructed to survive, not to terraform," he said. His tone held a trace of irritation, the kind used by officers who disliked surprises. Liam didn't flinch. "We didn't change the jungle," he replied. "We learned from it." There was silence for a long moment. The other instructor turned slowly, taking in the structures again. The Varkans' homes had thick bark supports woven with vines for insulation. The Zairi had built open platforms to allow their wings to stretch. The Turan shelters were reinforced with heavier wood and lined with moss for warmth. Every design reflected its builder's biology and needs, yet all shared the same core principle, the balance between structure and nature. "This wasn't part of the assessment," the lead instructor said at last, his voice quieter now. "It was meant to test endurance and discipline." Liam met his gaze. "Endurance isn't just about suffering," he said. "It's about understanding what makes you human, or Varkan, or Zairi, and working with what's around you, not against it." His words hung in the air, neither boastful nor defensive. He wasn't arguing for praise. He was stating truth. The instructors exchanged a look, one that carried both disapproval and reluctant admiration. Finally, the taller one sighed and tapped his wrist device. "Final report, survival metrics, exceeded, resourcefulness, unprecedented, cohesion, unexpectedly high." He paused, his eyes lifting toward the treetops again. "Innovation level, remarkable." The second instructor smirked faintly. "Looks like the human redefined the assignment," he murmured. The lead instructor gave a sharp nod and stepped back toward the shuttle. "Prepare for extraction," he said curtly, but his voice lacked its usual edge. As the cadets began gathering their gear, Syrah approached Liam, her expression thoughtful. "You could have kept all this to yourself." she said softly. "You could have stayed up there, above us, while we failed." He turned toward her, his gaze steady. "That wouldn't have meant much," he said. "Survival alone isn't victory. It's what we build from it that matters." She smiled faintly, lowering her head in acknowledgement. "Then I hope the Academy writes that in its report," he chuckled. "They'll forget as soon as we leave." When the time came to board the shuttle, no one rushed. The cadets took one last look around, their eyes scanning the tree houses they had built, the vines they had tied, the branches that had become their streets. It was hard to believe that this had once been a place of misery. Now it felt like leaving home. One by one they climbed down and made their way to the clearing, but Liam lingered behind. He looked up at his shelter, the first structure he had built, the one that had started everything. It was weathered but strong, its leaves rustling gently in the wind. He placed a hand on the trunk, feeling the slow pulse of life beneath the bark. "Thank you," he whispered. When he finally descended, the others were waiting by the shuttle. The lead instructor gave him a curious look before gesturing toward the ramp. "You've left quite an impression, human," he said dryly. "I suspect your next assignment will be less botanical." Liam smiled faintly and stepped aboard. "That's fine," he replied. "I'll bring the lessons with me." As the engines roared to life, the jungle below began to fade beneath clouds of steam and mist. From the small viewing window, Liam watched as the tree houses disappeared into the canopy, reclaimed by the forest. It struck him how temporary it all was, and yet how permanent the change within them felt. Verdara 3 would erase the traces of their presence soon enough, but the memory of what had been built there would remain in every cadet who had climbed above the mud and found peace among the branches. Hours later, back aboard the orbiting station, the debriefing was brief and formal. The instructors praised the cadets' adaptability, noted the humans' leadership, and declared the mission a success. But when the official report was archived, one line stood out among the dry technical summaries. "Human adaptation strategies, unexpectedly luxurious." Liam read it once and laughed quietly. It wasn't wrong. Comfort, after all, was humanity's greatest rebellion against the universe's indifference. He left the briefing room and stepped into the wide observation deck. Beyond the glass, Verdara 3 hung below, a shimmering world of green and blue mist, its storms flashing faintly in the distance. He thought of the cadets, of Syrah, of the Varkan who had once mocked him, of the Terran who had carried branches twice his size, and he felt something close to pride. The stars stretched endlessly beyond the planet, cold and indifferent as always. Yet for a moment, Liam felt that strange warmth again, the same one he had felt under his rainwater shower in the treetops. He had proven something to himself, that even in the most unforgiving places, humanity's gift was not just to survive, but to imagine something better. He turned from the window and walked down the corridor, the faint hum of the ship surrounding him. The forest was far away now, but its rhythm still echoed in his mind. The soft whisper of rain on leaves, the creak of wood in the wind, the heartbeat of the world itself. And somewhere, deep in the jungle below, his treehouse still stood, swaying gently among the living towers of Verdara 3, proof that harmony could be built even in the wildest corners of the galaxy.